Hello, true believers and Shred-Eye Nights. It's me, it's your buddy Kevin D, and we are once again broadcasting to you from the deep, dark recesses of Columbus, Georgia, inside the newly remodeled Fortress of Solitude. Cameraman Germ is in the room, and ladies, he is looking as shred-alicious as ever. Find him, look him up, see if you can find him. It's like finding Waldo, right? So what we're doing today is we're separating the pros from the Joes. We're talking about the little things that make beginners and intermediates frustrated and why people quit because they just get fed up with trying. The number one reason that I see people quit the guitar, and I've been doing this again since I was 17, and it's been more than a minute. The number one reason I see people quit is not being able to drop the fret hand. Most people want to play with their wrist and their forearm in straight alignment with the hand. And the problem is that works great for techniques like bending. And that works good if I'm doing some Jimmy chords where I've got to use my thumb and have some leverage there. But as far as normal playing, if my hand is in a straight line with my wrist and my forearm, I can't spread my fingers apart. It does not matter if I have fingers like a bunch of bananas or if I have little guy hands. I just can't spread my fingers apart. I've got no wingspan and no reach. I've got to create the space, as they say in jiu-jitsu and wrestling. I've got to drop and get this angle. So you've got to get accustomed and acclimated to almost waving at yourself. It's this drop, boys and girls, that creates the reach and the distance for these big stretches and for all that really shredderific stuff. And even it's what makes bar chords really possible. I'd say that I have a lot of people that for months and months and months, like some kind of cult leader dealing out the red Kool-Aid, I'll sit there and I'm like, you got to drop your wrist. You got to drop your wrist. You got to drop your wrist. And eventually some people will get it. And other people, for whatever reason, they just fight it tooth and nail. They fight themselves. And then eventually, what winds up happening is they get really, really frustrated with guitar and the pursuit of being able to play. And they quit. They drop out. They give up. When all it takes is literally just being able to do this. That's where all the reach comes from. So in the barring, if I've got to roll back that finger and take advantage of this bony ridge so it doesn't sound like, but I actually get the pressure there to close the gap on those high strings and get a clean bar. All of that space, all of that reach, whether it's a big 3-note per string stretch for shreddy stuff or barring, every bit of that reach, every bit of that clarity comes from dropping the wrist. Another thing that separates the pros from the Joes and causes people eternal frustration in their six-string pursuits is the importance of the left hand or the fret hand when it comes to muting. We all know about palm muting and the chugs, right? And that's this hand providing the staccato by deadening the strings. But I see so many players, they'll come in either the studio or here, and they'll go, man, my playing, there's so much of this resonant background noise, all of this ringing. And part of it comes, I think, from like this idea that a lot of people get from like their bad experiences with piano lessons and having to be curled up on your fingers, or maybe the cowboy chords in the first three positions, where a lot of times you got to get kind of perfectly squeezed in there on your fingertips to get that clean instead of and having a bunch of dead strings. We get the idea that as we progress up the neck and play more advanced concepts, that we've still got to be balanced like a ballerina on our tippy tips. Well, the problem is most of us are playing rock, metal, blues, or some type of modern music that involves overdrive, gain, distortion, some type of drive. And the guitar becomes very resonant. I mean, I can take her and you see it doesn't take much with just enough gain to get the strings going. So if you combine that gain and our volume with this extreme being on your tippy tips, you leave all the strings and the notes higher than whatever you're playing exposed. And so the whole time you're playing, you hear this wash of slop in the background while you're playing. So if I'm here and I'm playing this A note at the 5th fret of the low E string, all you hear is that A. Even just knocking on the body, that's the only thing. I can whack all 6 strings, and all you're hearing is that single A on the low E string at the 5th fret. Everything else is deadened, but it's not deadened over here in my picking hand. It's deadened in my fretting hand. It's deadened by the belly of the first finger and across what I call the ball of your palm. If you think about this area as being the ball of your palm, like the ball of your foot, which will also be something that'll help you out later on when we discuss bending in a future episode. But if I'm not like this, with all of this material exposed and my fingers laying flat against all the strings, I have the control. Nothing higher than the note I'm playing is exposed. If I have this and I just uncover the strings and arch up, disappears just simply by laying that finger down. So we can go from this to this. And that'll give you the control. It's all about control. Electric guitar, and especially playing at loud volumes with or without extreme amounts of gain, is all about control. Watch an Yngwie Malmsteen, watch a Steve Vai, watch a Guthrie Govan. You don't hear that slop in their playing because above all else, above speed, above vocabulary, above really even fretboard knowledge, they've all learned how to develop this muting and control. So if I'm just simply covering that up. Now, you may ask yourself, what happens when I move to another string? So I'm going to go to this D chord at the 5th fret of the A string. Again, my fingers are splayed out across these strings and I can hit everything. And all you hear is the 2 strings I'm holding down. And you might say to yourself, well, that's great for those strings, but what about the predicament of controlling this low E string now that I have uncovered? We don't want the D versus the E. That's going to give us a lot of sludge and it just doesn't sound nice. Again, I can control that with my fretting hand by simply positioning the first finger of my fretting hand to where I overshoot the A string just the tiniest bit to have the very tip, and just the tip, I'm going to have it rest against the E string. So now that's controlled. All that's kind of, so all I got to do, I can hit those 2 strings, all this above it, it's all covered up, it's all gone, all control. So if I smack the whole thing, all I'm getting is that D string. So control of the instrument and being able to clean up all the slop, even with a limited vocabulary, will make you sound so much slicker and so much more professional than if you have all that goop and gop kind of resonantly like ringing out. And another issue with this is a lot of younger players these days, they don't get to play much louder than what I would call Madison Square bedroom volumes. Not a lot of younger developing players get to play at what I would define as drummer volumes, loud enough to play live with a drummer. And this goes hand in hand with another issue in the use of too much gain, too much overdrive, too much distortion, whether it's with a pedal, whether it's with a preamp, whether it's with your amplifier and you're just using straight amp gain. Most players use too much distortion. It sounds really cool in your bedroom where you can talk over it and you're not making mom and dad beat on the door and tell you to turn it down or no one's calling the cops. But at the same time, I see way too many players when I go out to open mics and jam sessions, when they finally do get the chance to play with a drummer, they get this kind of like deer in the headlights, eyes as big as 2 fried eggs, and it's howling and screaming at them like rhinoceroses in mating season. And they're just like, oh my God, what's happening? How do I stop this? Not being able to control the distortion. And a lot of it falls on the fret, hand, and muting. You can think about it like this a lot of times. Anything higher than the note I'm playing is usually picked up by the back sides or the bellies of these fingers and the base of the palm. Anything lower than the note I'm playing can be covered by this hand. It can be covered by the index finger, or my thumb can come over the top in certain situations and mute that as well, especially if I'm reaching over for like a... My thumb is taking care of that low E string and maybe even some of the A string. The only reason it's sounding there is because there's a harmonic there at the 5th fret. But again, learning how to control what you're playing, learning how to control your amp, control your instrument. Now, back to this talk about using too much gain. It's really easy to crank the heck out of the bass, crank the heck out of the treble, cut back the mid-range, dime the gain, have the master volume or the channel volume on the amp at say like 1.5 to 3, and you get a really heavy like metal sound in your bedroom. But that's not doing you any favors when you play out live. If you're going to gig, you need to learn to play and control things at gig volumes. There's so much that can just happen with moving air and having the amp set that loud. You really need to learn to get on your game and control all this stuff. Again, this is one of the little things, the devil's in the details. It separates the pros from the Joes. Unfortunately, some guys, once they get to a certain level and they have all this knowledge, they're not necessarily so sharing and forthcoming because, they're protecting their spot on the card. They don't want some young buck to come and steal an audition or something from them. So they'd rather just keep these quote unquote secrets to themselves. But yeah, it's not doing anybody any favors to keep it in your head and die with it. So we got to keep this going, or else it's just going to wind up being like that. It's not that I'm old. Your music really does suck. So we got to fix this, boys and girls. Another thing, back to the distortion. As volume goes up on the master, distortion has to go down. This is another reason why, coupled with the lack of muting and control, that you see young players when they're in a live environment for the first time or the first few times, they can't solve the riddle of why everything's howling and screaming and feeding back on them. So being able to control all these things will really take you a lot farther. In regards to palm muting, I see that a lot of guys, when they're chugging or when they're playing rhythm guitar, they palm mute just fine, but they have no palm muting capabilities when it comes to playing single notes. And this, as instrumentalists and guitar players in particular, is where we get our staccato, which is music nerd speak for short and separated. So the notes don't bleed together. They don't touch, they're separated. And a hack for that I found worked for myself years ago that I'd like to pass around is whenever you're working specifically on your alternate picking. We all start out with that 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we go to 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Whatever it is that you're doing, whatever sequence, whatever pattern, if it's a scale sequence, if it's just a chromatic gibberish warm-up, maybe it wouldn't hurt for at least a little while. I still do this almost every day as a second religion. When you're working on your right hand technique, just build into the equation, palm mute everything. If you can palm mute everything, you can choose what to palm mute and not palm mute. But if you can't do a mechanic and you suddenly have to do it, you don't got a life jacket, you don't got a paddle, you don't got a canoe, and it's going to wind up being ugly. And you're going to wind up being frustrated with yourself, with the guitar. You're going to be like tense. You're going to be gritting your teeth, gritting your shoulders. You're going to be getting madder and madder. And then you're just beating yourself up psychologically, and you're transferring a lot of that frustration onto the guitar, and I'll never do it. And that's no good for any of us. We need you new players, and we need you new players to bring it and come prepared, because when guys from my generation, when we go to that, gray dead elephant graveyard in the sky, you guys got to pick up the ball and keep all this going. So, pass this around, pass this along, develop this control, just palm mute everything. It doesn't matter. I'm just, splayed out across those. I even would slow this down and do what I call super slow-mo practice. And I talk about this in my first book, Intelli-Shred, doing a self-inventory, where you slow your warm-up down. It's warming up. It shouldn't be a triple backflip over flaming swords. Slow it down, self-inventory. Am I not clenching my jaw? Am I breathing? You'd be surprised how many players hold their breath when they breathe. Are my shoulders relaxed? Are my arms relaxed? How's my posture? All of these things. And then in with that, a lot of times what I'm inventorying in my head is, can I feel these strings touching the bellies of these fingers as I come across any old exercise, or even on that, every string above what I'm playing is muted, because I'm slowing my brain down. I'm slowing my playing down. I'm actually taking the time to, inventory and catalog. Can I feel those strings resting under my fingers? I'd rather have you, slow down and develop the control to do this than to continue to be frustrated with your slop and your playing. Not too long ago, I had a kid come in one of the stores where I teach, and he was frustrated with his tone, according to him. And the first thing he does, he comes in and he goes, I need a distortion pedal. And so rather than just be a clerk and grab a distortion pedal and go, here you go, little buddy, they'll ring you up over there, I asked him why. And he said, well, when I chug, meaning palm muted heavy rhythms, it doesn't sound heavy. So I asked him what guitar and what amp, and he's using a Fender Squier into a PV Viper, and it's the stock, Asian made single coils or whatever, imported pickups. But still, a rock solid instrument. I could take that little setup and I could still go make money and pay the rent with it. But it didn't sound, to him. So I went over and I got the same model guitar he played, and I turned on the same amp, and I had him play. And the problem is he's totally on his tips, and he's just wailing away. And after a while, you hear all that versus, see how it went away? It was in his hands. He didn't need to spend more money on a distortion pedal, which I'm sure, everybody else involved would have been way happy if I'd have just shut my mouth and sold him a distortion pedal. But he didn't need to spend more money. What he needed to do is he needed to go back to the woodshed and spend more time practicing and boning up on his technique. But he just didn't know. And so much of stuff like this, the little detail stuff, the stuff that's not like 50 more ways to melt your friends' faces with shred licks, stuff like that sells books and magazines. But again, this minutia of cleaning up your playing, hand positioning, pick angle, pick geometry, how to get into a certain motion if it's even numbers, how to get out if it's odd numbers, different things like that. It's not really like the lifestyles of the rich and famous kind of a thing. It doesn't really scream like glamorous and, shred, versus just taking the time to develop the control. You can hear some guys can slay you with a note, and that note's perfect because they knew what part of the beat and over what chord and where to play it. And the only way to develop that is years and years of listening and years of playing the wrong note in the wrong spot at the wrong time. Trial by fire, jump in and get burned. The only people that ever really lose are the people that never really try. But, at the same time, let's slow this down. Let's slow ourselves down. Let's take a few steps back, especially during the warm up. It's just warming up. Shouldn't be like the most complicated thing you do. And let's get a little double mileage out of this warm up by inventorying our technique and working on building into our style, cleaning up this. The only way to make it happen is to make yourself do it, and to make yourself do it over and over and over again. And in the beginning, it's not going to feel natural. You're going to have to think about doing it. But if you don't force yourself to do it, and if you don't flex these muscles, it'll never, ever come out in your playing. I always tell my students and my friends, the me in the practice room, the me in here when there are no lights, no cameras, no pressure, nobody to entertain, that guy is maybe 6 months to a year or more down the road as far as complexity and vocabulary and what I'm doing, versus the guy that's on stage or the guy that's in front of a camera, because all of that newly acquired knowledge and technique or licks, phrases, and sequences, I have not repeated them enough until they were burned and ingrained in my muscle memory. Once they're burned into your muscle memory, then they just come out. At a certain age, you don't think about how to brush your teeth anymore. You don't think about how to tie your shoes. You don't think about backing out or parallel parking, hopefully. There's a lot of things that after you do them, I've read studies where it says after 10,000 repetitions, a muscle can fire off information on its own with no stimulus from the brain. That means that it just becomes nature. It becomes ingrained in you. This is why teens practice. This is the reason fighters practice different combinations. When someone's sitting on top of you on the mat and they're trying to pound your skull into the mat, is not the time to be wondering what if or how do I get out of this. There's only time for reaction. It's the same process live in the heat of battle when you're playing with your band on stage. To think what if is not necessarily the best thing running through your head in front of a sellout crowd. The things that come out the most in your playing are the things that you've worked on the longest. The very first licks you ever learn will come out when you've been playing 1,000 years, because those are the things that have been most often physically executed and rehearsed. So you have to make yourself do this stuff. That's the practice part of it. If you run it enough times just through rote, redundant repetition, it'll become second nature. Think back to when you were in grade school and they gave you vocabulary words and you had to learn how to spell them and you repeated them over and over and over. Okay? So that's the same as learning a new chord or a new scale or a new lick. And then what did the teacher make you do? He or she made you take those vocabulary words and make sentences out of them. And those sentences became paragraph. Well, the notes become a lick, the licks become a line, the line becomes some type of solo or motif, and on and on and on. It's the same whether it's your vocabulary on the instrument or the vocabulary in whatever your native tongue is that you've grown up learning how to speak. So take these things, slow yourself down, inventory yourself, go through the whole process, work on the muting, develop the control. When you can, bump the volume up, pull the gain down. Having said that, on a parting note, one cliche that I got absolutely sick and tired of hearing as a young rock and metal player was, oh, you got to learn how to practice without the distortion because distortion masks flaws in your technique. While that is true, if you're going to be playing a style of music based around heavy, overdriven, or distorted guitar tones, you have to learn how to control all that so it doesn't wind up being a great big howling wash of a mess. And the only way that you're going to learn how to control that is to practice using distortion. Just don't use so much. Cut it back. A lot of times, even as the volume goes up with maxed out distortion, the guitar sounds very small, very nasally. And a lot of times you get a ton of treble information, and that scratch and just the thinness. It's an abrasive sound, and it causes what I call listener fatigue. And once the audience's ear is fatigued, they're not listening, they're not hearing you, they're not going to hear you. It's like anybody will buy a ticket to see the world's fastest guitar player once. Think about it. One song, 3 songs, 20 minutes, an hour of that. What other trick have you got left? So once you've seen it all. Don't be that one trick pony. Don't be that guy. Slow it down, develop the control, just have a little patience. I know it's hard, but we're not talking about developing speed. Again, that's another topic for another episode. We're talking about cleaning up the sound, developing the reach, all the things that lead to frustration. Slow these things down, slow yourself down, develop the control, and you'll be infinitely happier. The better you sound, the better you play, because the better you sound to you, the better you feel about your playing, the more confident you become, the happier you'll be, and the happier your audience will be as well. I appreciate your time. I hope this reaches everybody and finds you in good health and happiness. Hope you have the very best day possible. Stay shred-alicious, and we'll catch you on the next one.